All right, Saagar, what's on your radar?
Well, the media missed it, but two little-noticed news items occurring around exactly the same time on Friday, taken together, show a political dynamic that emerged ahead of the bailout package, where the mainstream GOP is working more towards the ends of working people and small businesses than the mainstream of the Democratic Party. And you saw this as the direct cash payments took before the last bailout bill, when Nancy Pelosi, Kamala Harris, and other Democrats wanted much less in direct cash payments to Americans than people like Mitt Romney, Josh Hawley, Tom Cotton, and others. But now it's best on display in the difference between the presumptive Democratic nominee Joe Biden and Donald Trump in their healthcare response to this crisis. As we've covered here, Joe Biden has adamantly maintained that a Medicare for all single-payer system would have no effect on coronavirus, and thus has asked that the Trump administration reopen Obamacare exchanges so that people can buy healthcare. You might actually point out that it might be a little difficult for people to purchase healthcare when they just lost their job, and you'd probably be right. You would also find yourself at least in agreement, in this particular case, with Donald Trump. Yes, you heard me correctly. The Republican Trump administration is essentially beginning a single-payer experiment with their Friday promise to directly pay hospitals for coronavirus treatment for uninsured patients. As Walter Bragman aptly put it on Twitter in reaction, quote, "So Trump announced a single-payer experiment and Joe Biden is still urging him to reopen Obamacare exchanges where deductibles cost thousands of dollars. This is how Democrats lose." Well said, Walter. Your counter would be, well, there are Democrats who want single-payer for all medical conditions out there, and you would be right, except that the Democratic Party just underwent a concerted effort to destroy the candidate espousing that and make it as clear as possible that that movement is not welcome in their new suburban Wall Street coalition. Same dynamic at play with the newly announced plan from Senator Josh Hawley that would pay businesses 80% of working Americans' salary and would even apply retroactively to anyone who has lost their job as a result of this crisis. This marks the most economically progressive legislation introduced in the United States Senate so far in relation to worker pay. And as friend of the show, Zed Jelani points out, is on par with Denmark and other Nordic countries which are doing this as a result of the crisis. The plan to boot includes provisions that require American companies to accept the aid to move critical supply chains back to the United States. Now look, I have no illusions this plan will ever be enacted with majority support by the GOP. But I do know, based on what happened throughout the bailout negotiations, is that Hawley's plan will have a hell of a lot more influence on what the GOP response looks like than anything introduced by progressive Democrats like Bernie Sanders and AOC, who have essentially no influence in their actual policymaking within their party. Joe Biden, Nancy Pelosi, and Chuck Schumer have the power, and the GOP is listening at least a little bit to its current working-class champions. And in the long run, that might be enough of an opening to remake the party and the country in the years to come. And Crystal, all caveats included, they all voted for it. They all voted for the bill.
Yes.
They didn't say anything about the corporate element, but neither did anybody else. Everybody voted for it. But my whole point is that when you're looking at this across the board, is like I said, Bernie can have whatever plan he wants. Chuck Schumer's not listening. Nancy Pelosi's not listening. And as we covered with you, he doesn't seem aptly politically positioned enough in order to use the leverage in the movement that he has in order to try and insert that into the actual policymaking process. So if you look at it on the merits, I mean, I thought that was so funny. I mean, because you saw Anand and so all these other progressives being like, oh my God, like there is a single payer experiment being enacted by the Republican president of the United States, while the Democratic nominee is bashing single payer, says he would veto Medicare for all, and wants to reopen the Obamacare exchanges.
Yeah.
Who is fundamentally, on this one issue, who is more progressive?
Yeah.
Trump. No question.
Yeah.
And same thing when you look at that Hawley plan. Like I said, I don't think the Hawley plan will bear any resemblance to what ends up happening, but it will have so much more influence in the policymaking process than Bernie Sanders will have on the Democratic side.
On the healthcare piece, if we just focus on the healthcare piece, I mean, there's just no denying that what you're saying is correct.
Yeah.
That the Democrats, once again, totally outflanked here by the president saying, no, we're just gonna pay for all of it, right? Forget
cash
about
infusion to a hospital.
Right.
That's it. That's what they've been fighting
for years. Forget about opening up the Obamacare exchanges, which are a nightmare and which don't, a lot of
and cost
states
a lot of money.
Cost a lot of money. A lot of states don't have a lot of good options, all of that stuff, which, look, I wish they would do it. It'd be better than the situation now. But they just leapfrog right past that and say, no, let's just pay for it. Let's just get it done. Right. And it does remind me of 2016, where Trump, in a lot of ways, was able to get to the left of Hillary on health care. Now, he didn't actually have a plan. He just said, we're going to cover everybody. He basically embraced universal health care, but never actually had a plan to back it up. But by just rhetorically doing that, was able to run to the left of Hillary in the same way he's going to be able to run to the left of Joe Biden on certain critical economic issues. Whether he's genuine in those desires or not, it can be quite effective. On the other hand, I'd push back that Bernie had no impact on the bailout bill. I think part of why he ended up voting for it is because they included the thing he was pushing for with unemployment to add that $600 a week. Some of the reporting indicates that his ideas were, in fact, influential there. So I don't want to leave that out of the discussion. I also don't want to give the Republicans too much credit because we've trashed Nancy Pelosi, rightfully so, and the Democrats for floating the SALT cap tax deduction thing that benefits millionaires.
So I will also say
let's say let's remember that. Yeah, he said we don't need to do anything anymore, right? Nancy's floated something that helps millionaires and overwhelmingly. But what we're hearing from the administration now is payroll tax cut, capital gains tax cut. Are you kidding me? And infrastructure week. And of those three things, infrastructure would be the best of the three. And that's the one that's most controversial.
Right. Well, it's, like I said,
so let's not give them too much credit on any of this.
No, look, I'm not. There's no revolution happening here right now. I'm saying corporatism strain both parties hardcore. 95% of what you get from both is where. So where is at least something on the margins coming in from? On the Bernie side, unemployment, but there were a lot of Republicans who were pushing for beefed up unemployment insurance too. So when I look at this, I'm like, and I know that this plan is getting serious discussion amongst the Senate GOP. And at the end of the day, if the government employs any sort of tax cut whatsoever, that's the way that this works, tax rebate. I mean, essentially just pays businesses outright in order for their employees, because that's the system that we currently have in place. If they even do that to the tune of like 20, 30, 40%, that's a massive move. I mean, even the biggest country on Earth, the biggest economy on Earth, to do that in resemblance to Denmark or some of these other Nordic countries, that is a massive sea change in economic policy.
And it would be, and it's what we've been pushing for here, because then you keep workers attached to their jobs, and then it's easier too. It's not just provides some certainty and some comfort in the short term where you've got a job to go back to. It's the same job you've been doing. Okay, there's that. It also helps you to recover more quickly because you do. Once things start to open back up, you go right back to the thing that you were doing. There isn't this massive.
There's no unemployment. You have to get fired and all this other stuff.
The interesting thing is this is what Bernie has started to really push for as well. I watched his appearance on Real Time with Bill Maher, which, by the way, so weird seeing him do it out of his home. Right. I mean, it's just, especially that show is such an elaborate production with the live audience whenever to just see Bill like in his backyard is really strange. But that was what Bernie was pushing for, was for them to cover 100% of those payroll costs exactly for those reasons. What we really would like to see is, when are Bernie and Josh Hawley and the economic populists, when are they going to start talking to each other? Because that's when you get real power, is when you have members from both parties. I mean, we really haven't seen anything like that in the modern era, with economic populists from both parties actually working together on it. And there's a narrow lane here where that could actually come to fruition.
It's been 100 years since something like that has happened. And I guess what I'm saying and by the way, I could be completely wrong, because I want to be very clear. There's no guarantee that Hawley and these other people are going to win. And they're going to win in the long run. What happened to Bernie in 2020 could happen to them in 2024. Nikki Haley and Mike Pence and these people could run the table and say that they're the natural heirs to Trump. I don't think that will happen, but I think it's certainly possible.
Good. Yeah.
But what I'm saying is I'm like, okay, they just undertook this concerted effort. Kill Bernie, kept him out. They're giving him no concessions on policy. They let them make their floor speeches. I've covered this with AOC. You say whatever you want. Focus on the culture a little bit more. Vote for the bill, and you're good. And so they figured out this little dance where the progressives have very, very little power, and the corporatists like Nancy Pelosi, Chuck Schumer, and others run the table in terms of the response. On the GOP side, Mitch has not as much control over that as people like to think. Of course, he's immensely powerful, bringing people to vote, but they forced their hand on direct cash payments from the right populace. They forced their hand on that. I mean, look, they didn't fight as hard on the corporate stuff, and I wish they had. But on this particular play, they have much more leverage with the Republican leadership than the progressives do with the Democratic leadership.
Well, and here's true. And here's the other piece is wherever you are politically, I think we both have the view that the broadest swath of the American public that is not really represented right now is that which is left economically, fairly left economically, and more culturally moderate or conservative.
Right.
And what it appears to be the case, that Republicans are having an easier time embracing some of those economic populist or left elements than Democrats are embracing some more cultural moderation.
Yeah.
And so that's what we're really when we're thinking about how this realignment is going to work, who's going to be able to grab that broad swath in the middle that will be the coalition that creates real power. What it looks like today is that the right is having an easier time embracing some elements that could give them broader appeal than Democrats.
Yeah, and I want to make sure that I'm not like, no big change. No, these are nascent, like little wisps. But it's like, and you could point to the same thing in the Democratic Party over the last 4 years, but we know ultimately how that story played out. What I'm trying to point to are there's some bubbling things that are these wisps that are coming out. And the party has a choice. They can kill it in 2024, which I think a huge effort will be undertaken to do so.
Yes.
But the one thing that we do know is that the people themselves, the base, is 100% in for these type of policies. So if a good enough communicator can come along to bring this type of policy, bring real policy to what these people actually want, the Republican establishment, as we found out in 2016, is toothless and an empty, emperor with no clothes. So I'm hoping that that continues to be the case.
We will see.
All right.
Next up on Rising, firefighters among those on the front lines of the pandemic and being hit hard. We're going to hear from the International Association of Firefighters about the particular challenges that these first responders are facing when Rising continues.